Welcome. I am Matthew Westaway, and I'm joined by Phillip Garlick, who is the Managing Director of Product Partnerships. Welcome, Phillip. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks for inviting us.
So, Phillip, today we're going to have a really interesting discussion around authorization, FCA authorization. We're going to look at appointed representatives, and then we're also going to look at buy now, pay later. Phillip, you've been operating in the space for a long time. Do you want to perhaps give the viewers a bit of a background into who you are and how you came into this role today?
Yeah, we've only got an hour though, Matthew. So, I've been in financial services businesses now for over 30 years, so usually at the lending end of the spectrum. So I guess in many ways, I'm poacher turned gamekeeper now, where I'm on the compliance side. But compliance has always been part of the DNA of every business I've worked in. So has a lot of synergies with the firm that I'm with now, and product partnerships. As you know, we're an outsourced compliance company that support a number of firms, both lenders, brokers, and such like.
Wow, Phillip, 30 years. I didn't realize as long as that you really don't look your age.
Well, you're very kind, but I guarantee I am. My wife will contest to that. So, it flies by.
So Phillip, if we start off with the authorization application, you've been in the industry for a long time. With the consumer duty coming in and the changes that's brought into the sector, how have you seen authorization change?
Well, I think the headline news is it's far more challenging. When you think about the different types of applications that go into the FCA, so you've got limited permissions applications, full permissions lending, and then you've also got things like change of controllers and variations of permissions. So there are different types of permissions. But broadly speaking, one thing that has definitely changed since the duty came into play is more challenging. You've got to consider the FCA has always had the premise of being consumer champions, which is quite right. And one of their key objectives in their business plan this year and beyond is protecting consumers. So it kind of makes sense as to why it's more challenging. How that manifests itself, though, in terms of the application process, there's now a gateway. And that gateway, as the name suggests, is sort of a filtration process where the FCA take out bad applications or weak applications. So I'm not saying necessarily they would have got through before, but it's far more rigorous now at the start of the process and ongoing thereafter. And there are questions that will be asked of the firm and the management of the firm that are quite extensive and for some applicants quite scary. And so if you're not accustomed to the language that's used and the questions that are posed, it can be quite a challenging process. So very much has changed for the better for the consumer.
Yeah, so it's got more challenging, harder questions being asked. What are some of these tough questions? What do you see firms really battling to answer? Is there any specific things that stand out?
Yeah, I think there are a number of mistakes that are made by firms. But the first thing I'd say is, I often speak to clients and they often understand their businesses very well. And if I said to you, tell me about Voice, tell me about your firm, you could talk for days, weeks and months about the wonderful business you've created and what it does and everything else. And that alludes to what the business plan should look like. And quite often firms, when you think about putting their application in, just fail to write down some fundamentals. What are the financials? What is the proposition? How are you going to attract customers? Which customers are you going to attract? And it's getting that down on paper. It's referred to as the regulated business plan. But, this jargon can quite often scare firms. And I think it's very important just to talk in language you understand to start with and get down on paper your ideas.
Okay. So what you're saying is that firms will have to put together this regulatory business plan, and do they kind of overthink it maybe, or it's just something they haven't done that. They know their business so well that they almost forget to put down the obvious stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we handle a lot of applications. If I take limited permissions applications, for example, as the name suggests, it's limited in nature in terms of scope. They're usually secondary credit brokers that are selling their goods and services and using a finance vehicle to purchase it. So buying a fridge from Currys, for example.
Yeah.
And on that premise, it's the same rigor is applied to any firm, and more depth is required. But it's very much focused. I've written down here: people, proposition, and the actual firm itself. So what I mean by that is the FCA are interested in who's running this business. Who are you? What's your background? Where have you been? What businesses have you run? And asking some very practical questions. There's some checks to do within that, such as DBS checks and security checks and so on, background checks. But just talking about who are actually running the business. The proposition side of things is just them understanding. You bear in mind that case officer at the FCA might deal with a carpet company in the morning and a technology company in the afternoon. And there are some departments within the FCA that specialise. But generally speaking, they need to understand, the case officer needs to understand themselves, what is it you do as a business? And in some instances, that's very obvious and easy to understand. If I take green energy, for example, that's quite complex. And so that it needs telling in a manner that anybody could understand, really simple terms. And then the firm itself, just understanding the structure of the firm and its finances, is not sufficient just to say, we intend doing X thousands of pounds of the revenue over the next 5 years. It needs a P&L, a balance sheet, and a cash flow for the next 3 to 5 years, and have a well thought out plan that goes alongside it. I think a number of areas where individuals, when they try and do these applications themselves, struggle is fairly to disclose certain matters, for example. So there are certain issues that have to be disclosed and would be met with some degree of resistance. But if you always work on the basis, the FCA, what they want to hear and understand is full disclosure. You just don't keep anything hidden away. That is an absolute sin in any application process, is non-disclosure of issues and background information that should be told to the FCA. It's all part of the fit and proper test.
Fantastic. That, writing the business plan in almost a layman language that anyone can understand, that a case officer can understand, makes me think of the shareholders' letters of Jeff Bezos. So they are, I don't know if you know this, Philip, but he writes them with the English grammar level of grade 8. So that someone with a grade 8 education will be able to understand them. And a similar light, Warren Buffett, he also writes his shareholders' letters as if they are being read by I believe it's his grandparents, so that they can understand them.
I can relate to that. I spoke to a client recently, and he was struggling with Consumer Duty Board report, for example. And I said, look, forget the label. Just tell me how you deliver good customer outcomes. And he spent 40 minutes telling me a wonderful story about his customers and the outcomes that he achieves. And I said, right, let's get that down on paper then now and just walk through it together. And I think, again, sometimes some applicants can overcomplicate matters, get lost in the jargon, get lost in the science, when in reality, it's just about telling a compelling story in a practical manner, in some language that they would understand themselves.
Yeah. And do you spend a lot of your time, Philip, on literally trying to get that essence of what they do in a way that can be understood by the case officer?
Yeah, I think when we support firms, they'll often ask us to do the application for them, which is what we're paid to do. We can't do it for them, we'll do it with them. So we're going to ask a lot of questions about them ourselves. So it doesn't suffice to have one paragraph or one sentence. We need them to explain to us what the business is about. I think we get, since the duty came into play, we get more firms now who have attempted to put an application in and have it withdrawn. So quite often the FCA may refuse, may approve, but they equally could ask the firm to withdraw their application because it's not quite right.
Oh, wow.
And that withdrawal process, usually then they've got to start all over again. It's just learning from that. What mistakes were made? What issues were highlighted? And how can we make sure that that doesn't happen again?
That leads us to sort of onto the mistakes. So you mentioned there that full disclosure, often that's something which firms don't do to the best of their ability. What are the other mistakes you see firms making?
Well, just adding to the disclosure side of things. I mean, one common question at the moment is around previous directorships and businesses that have been operated before. You're allowed to run a business that, for example, may have become insolvent, but how is that business closed down? Were any customers detrimented as a result? Is there a pattern of behaviour here that's inappropriate? And it's just understanding that properly. And the FCA want professional people running professional businesses with the consumer in mind. And so, thinking about those disclosures and making sure that things have been rectified and remedied from the past correctly is fine as long as it is disclosed. But beyond that, there are some technical considerations. So, for example, not meeting threshold conditions. Business must be solvent, for example. Might sound obvious, but having a good set of financials that says, well, if you say you're going to do X pounds of revenue over the next 3 years, have you sufficient capital to protect consumers and deliver on that plan? And there's more scrutiny around the financials now, more scrutiny around the individuals, rather than, is this proposition right for the consumer? It's just how are you going to deliver on it? So the bar's been raised in terms of leadership needed in businesses now to operate regulated businesses.
Wow. So we looking at sort of the people, the proposition, and the P&L, you're seeing mistakes being made on people not disclosing or previous directorships, potentially the P&L not having enough capital to demonstrate that the business has got legs for the future and growth. On the proposition, do you see any specific mistakes being made there?
Yeah, I mean, definitely having the adequate oversight, so a compliance monitoring plan to oversee the activity that's being conducted is quite key. So you might be talking about a firm that has not started trading yet, for example. They haven't got these things in place, but what is the plan? And so if they're interacting with customers face-to-face in a retail environment, that's one thing. Commonly now, with the digital technology growing quite rapidly, e-commerce firms are quite common in terms of their proposition. But then engagement with customers outside of that, over the phone, through Teams videos, chatbots, and so on, it's essential that how does the firm demonstrate it's monitoring that activity and it's appropriate? So if there are disclosures that need making to customers, are they being made accurately? And a vulnerable customer has been identified, recorded, and looked after, and not treated any differently. So it becomes far more challenging in terms of how you do that. And we've embraced RegTech technology in a number of different versions, deliberately for that reason, not to overtake what human intervention can do, but to inform.
To inform it. Philip, I must say, and this is something which is not, I'm not to sort of blow your trumpet here, but I haven't met a firm that has more RegTech than Product Partnerships Limited. I think you've got every solution under the sun to make sure you're covering everything.
Yeah, I think we've embraced a number of different platforms, and we've got partners like you got Voice and others, Commentus, Vulnerability Registration Service, Fingerprint. There's a number of firms out there, and they're all part of the toolbox that we give to my compliance team. So we effectively say, right, if we're going to work with this firm and we're going to help them oversee the activity, how are they engaging with the customer? Well, if they're doing it over the telephone, plug in Voice, and that call listening software will monitor those calls. If you are doing written communication, such as CRM campaigns or mass email campaigns, how are they being monitored? So how are you looking after monitoring these different customer interactions in different media types? Because that's the consumer driving that now.
Yeah.
Before it was always good old-fashioned retail many years ago. Now there's different mediums that are used to interact with the customer. So you've got to be able to listen to them. And you've kind of two choices. You either use sampling, which is the old-fashioned way of doing things, which will take 10 calls, or mystery shop retail environment sort of situations. And you might take a sample of 10, but randomly they could all be positive. And what this technology is doing now is steering you towards the things you need to be looking at.
You need to look at,
But it still needs the human intervention to actually review it. The technology is just part of the solution.
Can you talk a bit about that? What are the changes you've seen then? As I mentioned, you've been ahead of the game with all of your reg tech and fantastic team that you have, and the amount of resources you have on board to make sure that the software is executing accordingly. But what are you seeing in that space of regulation?
So there's a lot of changes in the principal AR regime, as you've alluded to. And if we just talk, we support firms that have got AR networks, whether that be 1, 5, 10 or more. And how those firms approach that AR network and the demands placed upon those principal firms now by the FCA have changed quite dramatically. For some, it wasn't a big shift because they were doing a lot of things themselves. For others, it was quite a seismic shift. The FCA identified a number of increasing complaints compared to directly authorised firms, which is why they made that intervention, that disconnect of overseeing a firm that is not regulated under the permissions of that principal firm had to be better controlled. The types of changes that they've made, well, now there is a requirement to conduct deeper due diligence. That it's more about the nature of the regulated activity undertaken. So even though that AR, that appointed representative, is empowered to do certain activity, what activity are we talking about? What is it in the customer journey they'll be doing? The principal firm has got to have adequate oversight. Now, those are just two words. The reality of adequate oversight could be quite vast. So how much intervention and interaction does the principal firm have with the AR? You've now got to give 30 days notification minimum to the FCA before any AR goes live, which, to be fair, it should be fairly reasonable. I think most firms have got an onboarding process. I think firms that were onboarding ARs quicker than 30 days, I'd question how much due diligence and setup was being done. And they've got certain attestations and reports now to send through to the FCA, whereas before their reporting in reg data was part of the wider principal firms reporting, and so there was no visibility. It's now reported on the individual AR level. So the principal firm has got to report its regulated activity and its ARs individually. And there have been two, from memory, what they call Section 165 demands for information from the FCA on this. So they can start to get under the skin of what are the ARs actually doing. And another quite seismic change for some firms has been the annual report. You've got to produce an annual report now that gives a summary of the key risks, where you've identified potential consumer harm, what actions are being taken and such like. But I think the biggest thing is just understanding that that principal firm is accountable for the behaviour of that AR. That you can't just walk away from it and say, well, we've signed a contract and that's the end of it. The complaints that belong to that AR actually belong to the principal firm. And so it's taking it very seriously that it's the principal firm that's accountable, not the AR. They're being empowered to carry out certain activity.
Philip, I was looking at some data earlier on, and the amount of supervisory cases by the FCA supervisory team for principal firms, it's 50 to 400% more than non-principals. And it varies between general insurance to retail lending, but retail lending is got a huge difference. The supervisory cases are way more in the principal firms. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, the AR regime spans different markets. So bear in mind, you've got wholesale and retail markets, as well as lending, broking and such like mixed in that. So a lot of this data I would argue, leans more towards the wholesale market. But harm was identified, you're quite right, in some of the retail sectors. I mean, I think the key thing is the disconnect that some firms weren't conducting good due diligence, and secondly, weren't monitoring anything in terms of consumer interaction. So if the AR, for example, is interacting with consumers again via telephone, via CRM campaigns, or whatever the medium might be, the different channels, then what's really important is they're able to monitor and intervene and monitor what's going on in these ARs. And I think, that disconnect of, well, we've signed a contract and we'll allow them to carry out the activity, but the AR firm doesn't understand its regulatory responsibilities to the principal, is quite interesting.
There was a survey, I believe, where they asked ARs how much, so they asked principal firms, how much non-financial misconduct have you logged? I think that was about a year ago. The FCA sent out a survey to ARs to ask them questions about, or was it to principals? I just saw something in the news.
Yeah, I mean, the FCA started to ask for data around regulated activity, regulated financial activity, non-regulated financial activity, and non-regulated non-financial activity. In other words, what's going on in the AR? That's what they're asking now. And I think some principal firms do a really good job on understanding the relationship and understanding the nature of the business that they're carrying out. But others, there is a huge disconnect between what the principal firm understands the AR is doing and what they're actually doing. So what the FCA are now asking is, could you tell us more about that non-regulated activity? And that's quite a seismic change for the FCA, because the FCA is obviously about regulated activity historically. But now under the duty, we're talking about delivering good customer outcomes. And so we're now posing questions about non-regulated activity as well.
Okay. So Philip, could you just sort of explain to our viewers, what is a non-regulated activity? What does that look like? Would that be, some examples?
Well, I mean, you've got buy now, pay later is a good example of non-regulated financial activity. You've also got flexi rental is common in the motor sector, for example. So under 90 days, rental agreements are non-regulated. But if that rental agreement is renewed and renewed and renewed and goes beyond 90 days, then it suddenly becomes regulated. So there's a lot of activity out there in the marketplace that is potentially hidden as non-regulated, when in reality its behaviour says it's regulated. And so the FCA is sort of prodding around that and looking at that and just making sure there is no consumer harm. And equally, with the buy now, pay later market, potentially going to regulate that market now. That times are changing with some products that were deemed to be low risk, low harm, and were happy to be non-regulated activity, but now are likely to move towards being regulated activity. So it's understanding what's going on in the AR.
Okay.
That's key.
All right. So the FCA is asking ARs, what types of unregulated activity are you doing? Are you doing any buy now, pay later? Are you doing any of this rental that can supposed to be under 90 days, but it's getting perpetually renewed? How is the FCA tackling this unregulated area? What powers are they using?
In terms of buy now, pay later, or more generally?
Let's look at generally, and let's get into buy now, pay later.
I think really with the AR regime, it is about understanding the activity that they're undertaking. And again, in the example of the 90-day rental market, which is common, as I said, in the motor sector, a lot of those agreements are renewed. And so the customer never actually gives the car back. So it actually behaves more like a regulated product. But that's an issue in itself. And sort of poses a number of questions. So the answer to your question in terms of why the FCA is asking these questions is just so they can understand what's going on behaviourally in these markets, which might inform their intervention and controls. I mean, you could, in some instances, be accused of acting outside permissions, for example. But generally speaking, I think again it's just making sure the principal firms understand their responsibility over the ARs and understand what activity they're undertaking. Because you're going to bear in mind, again, we're talking about wholesale and retail markets, and in the wholesale market, pensions, investments, and such like, very different than someone buying a fridge out of a retail store, for example.
Yeah. If we look at these permissions and the scope that these firms are operating in, especially these ARs, why is it important for principal firms to monitor the interaction that the ARs are having?
Well, I mean, if we start with FOS, for example, the Financial Ombudsman Service. So, as we know, customers can follow a complaints process, and during that complaints process can ultimately land in FOS's lap. So, the arbitration of, we can't come to an agreement, I'm not happy, I want to take it further. Quite commonly now, customers will choose to, and they've got every right to, go to FOS by default, and they haven't followed the complaints process to start with. You can't stop that behaviour, and the FOS are within their right to review that case. So coming back to your question, it's useful to know, well, if that customer's made 16 phone calls to complain, if the principal firm can access those phone calls and listen to what actually went on, and bear in mind that conversation could have been 15 minutes in length, so getting to the actual nucleus of the issue very quickly is essential. And so I think we can triage these situations much more rapidly. We can have a deeper and wider understanding of the activity that's the conversations that have been had with these customers. And it gives more evidence that, we've got control of what's going on. And if, ultimately it's been identified that customer was treated inappropriately and harm was identified, putting it right, very quickly. I think most firms want to do the right thing, and getting that information to the table quite quickly is critical, so they can actually make the right decision, a right informed decision. But then I think, independent of that, the FOS case fees now, I think they've dropped to £650 per case. It becomes a very costly exercise. So defending your complaints process, identifying vulnerable customers and such like, is a key part of any oversight that you do with the manner in which you actually engage with customers.
And Phillip, supervision, how often do you see principal firms, doing it? Is it on an annual basis per the FCA's recommendation, or do you recommend they go in and have oversight as to what's being done on a regular basis?
It's definitely risk informed. I mean, there isn't a one answer to that question. So, from our point of view, depending on the level of activity and the risk of any harm to consumers will inform the types of oversight that's undertaken. But, we're an external compliance company. We do a principal AR audit inspection program. We'll inspect the principal and we'll inspect the appointed representative. And in that program, we're looking for controls between the two. So if the principal says, we have a meeting once a month and we discuss these key points, we'll then speak to the AR and say, could I see the minutes of that meeting and what points were discussed? So it's just testing the controls between the principal and the AR. Other fundamental checks, financial promotions is a key one. So that the AR has no ability to sign off its own financial promotions. It's got to get them approved from its principal. So is that happening? What is that approval process look like? Is it recorded? Is it documented? And what is that vetting process look like? So I think it's very much informed by the level of activity and the nature of activity that's undertaken with customers.
Yeah. Well, I'll say one thing for your business is that your oversight happens in seconds. So your reviews with all your reg tech, it's basically in real time, always on, as opposed to doing a review, once a month or at least annually. Yeah.
What the value we can add to firms around this, as I say, before it was about sampling. So you can only realistically take X number of cases, and if as a result of that output, it was a positive output, you may not look further. But if it was a negative output, you would look deeper and wider. What RegTech's enabled us to do now is look at everything, and it drills down to the areas that the human intervention needs to review in more detail. So it might look at 10,000 calls, but say there's only 5 calls that actually need to be triaged, and then actually investigating those more thoroughly.
There's something which I also have seen firms underestimate, is the amount of time and effort it takes of senior management if they get put under a skilled person review. So the time and the resources required to respond and work with the FCA if you are under that review is immense. Have you seen something similar?
Yeah, I mean, it's not for the faint-hearted. I mean, the powers that the FCA have, are second to none, and rightly so. But defending your side, I find the FCA is quite palatable, that you can have an interactive. As long as you can see good process and well-documented process, and that the intent is to create a good outcome for customers, then that's great. And, for example, if you get large spikes in volumes of complaints and they're ignoring them, that's not good process. If the board is focused around, look, there's a sudden increase in complaints here, what's driving that? What's causing that? How do we fix that? And getting under the skin of those conversations and getting to the sort of front line is quite key.
You touched on, Phillip, you spoke around the FOS, and we then also spoke earlier on about buy now, pay later. I want us to move the conversation to buy now, pay later. Do you believe that that's going to have potential regulation, and potentially will that fall under the FOS? Will the FOS then have to expand their own operations?
Yeah, I mean, look, buy now, pay later has come under the looking glass over the past couple of years, and rightly so. There is, in practical terms, nothing to stop my daughter, for example, wandering down the high street and building up £3,000, £4,000, £5,000 of debt to buy now, pay later firms. And there's a real variety of approaches by firms out there. Some are doing it really well, and some aren't doing it so well. Your questions, very important. That there is no timeline at this moment in time for that market to become regulated. In my opinion, it will, but it's got to go through a number of stages. It's got to go through Parliament. If you look at some of the papers published between the Treasury and the FCA, I think everybody's leaning towards that happening, but there's no roadmap that's been published yet that's to say that there's a timeline for that to happen. That being said, what has happened is dialing up the pressure on firms to make sure that the financial promotions that are promoting these products are monitored properly. And that's definitely something that's changed now, and again, quite rightly so.
It's speaking about your daughter, I didn't realize, Phillip, up until early on today, that you would get, if you miss your payment, you have a late fee. But it's almost, it's just another name for interest in a way.
Fees and charges are really important. Again, that should be part of the disclosures. I won't talk firm specific, because I think client, one of the larger firms out there that's trying to push the right behaviours out into the market, and they're equally a regulated firm in their own rights. It's slightly different, but you're right. There are fees and charges. I think the biggest thing is that affordability and creditworthiness. The buy now, pay later products, they don't have the same rigor as a normal loan product. We're all accustomed to being asking a certain number of questions about income and expenditure to work out whether or not you can afford to pay this loan back. But when it comes to buy now, pay later, many of those filters aren't in place. Some firms choose to put them in. They have, they do use credit bureau data to make an informed choice, which is a very positive move forward. But, I think from a financial promotions point of view, and keeping it to my example, which I hope's not true, that my daughter can go out there and take on lots of credit. such as this, it's kind of, from a consumer's perspective, it's a lovely product, giving me a little bit of breathing space to pay it back in 9 months with no additional costs is great. But as you say, there are consequences to paying late. There are consequences to missing that 9 payment if it is paying 9. And the financial promotion needs to make clear what these risks and benefits are.
Yeah.
It's all about the plus side. There's about the bad side as well.
So what I'm hearing, Philip, is they need to balance the benefits and the risks, and just make sure people don't act on impulse. Too much impulse buying, I think, is where the harm is coming.
Yeah, I mean, look, Comp 5 rules, without getting too technical, are relatively explicit. So prominence, disclosures, positioning, all these are factors you've got to think about in a financial promotion. And you think from a consumer's perspective, you read an ad, you can, again, get lost in technical sort of review. And would you get from that ad a clear balance between the risks and benefits of that product? And if the answer is no, then it's not right. It needs reviewing.
I gave Currys a call, Philip, the other day. Just wanted to find out, if they're doing any call monitoring. So I phoned Currys and I asked them. I said, I have a question regarding buy now, pay later, and they put me through to a consultant in the store who answered the phone and said, "Hi, how can I help?" And I said, I've missed the payment. What does that mean? And the lady said, "I can't answer that question. You need to contact the lender." And I said, I was quite impressed because I wasn't expecting them to say that. I thought they would tell me, a different answer or try answer it. How important is it for those conversations to be monitored? Have you seen a need for that?
I mean, I think it's a definite positive move forward for firms that operate these products. I mean, the problem you've got with buy now, pay later, and let's just describe what we mean by buy now, pay later. So to be exempt, it needs to be under 12 months, under 12 payments or less, under 12 months, interest-free. So classic buy now, pay later products. So if it is that's an unregulated product. So the onus on the firm selling those products is not the same as a regulated finance product. But again, I come back to the financial promotions. So any inducement to credit does meet the requirements with regards to how it's presented and that the risks and benefits are portrayed. So, but coming back to your question about monitoring those calls or monitoring that behaviour, of course, it's a positive move forward. I mean, I'm finding now that firms are getting ready for what they see as the inevitable. Let's start acting like a regulated firm, even though we're not. Let's put the right behaviours in place. So again, using credit bureau data to make an informed decision about whether or not you can afford that buy now. But I think the key is, listening to those conversations, whether they're over the phone, in store, or whatever. That's a key part of oversight. Listening to the actual conversation with the customer, because that's where you'll get at the core. Where the issues arise.
And this, you mentioned Kong 3 and this, Financial Services and Market Act of 2000. Do you believe that is almost, that wasn't designed for this? So it was almost by accident that it's being able to help the FCA cover this sector.
No, I agree. I don't think it was designed for that, but it does fall under the regime. And I think that's what people, I wouldn't say forgot, but missed. So about 18 months ago, 2 or 3 shot across the bows were sent out in Dear CEO letters to firms. And this applies to all firms doing buy now, pay later. The merchants of those firms, so the actual retailer that's selling the buy now later product, which again it will be unregulated, and the regulated firms that were supposed to be approving these financial promotions. So these rules all apply. And as you've said, Matthew, it's the Financial Services and Markets Act. It's Section 21 of that Act, which now has been almost used as the badge in our industry. We're terrible with jargon in compliance companies, but the Section 21 approvers. So firms like us approve those financial promotions, and you've got a mechanic in place that allows firms that produce those products to send their financial promotions through to us, to get them approved and then pass them out to their network. but moreover that the oversight of those firms now is monitored thereafter. There's all right signing off a financial promotion, but how do you know it actually ended up in front of the customer in the right way? So that's changed quite dramatically. And, you know, there are very few Section 21 approval firms out there, as I understand. And the gateway for applications for firms like ourselves to do that work only opened in the first half of this year. So it's relatively new in terms of being under greater scrutiny by the FCA.
And Philip, if we just have to think of the retailer, just a final point, they've always been subject to the advertising standards. So for them, is it not like a bit verbose to have to do two things?
Yeah, I think what most merchants do, so what most providers offer is a merchant pack. So if you're a retailer and you take a buy now, pay later product from a lender and you implement their platform, they usually give you a merchant pack that says this is approved collateral that you can use to advertise your products. Now, the problem with that sometimes is the interpretation of those rules can be lost. And it's very important that what's being approved is actually carried out at the front line in front of the customer. And it isn't manipulated, changed, and the content and intent is changed in some ways. So coming back to your point, you've suddenly then got this huge vacuum of lots of retailers that should be having their financial promotions approved by a regulated individual, a regulated firm like ourselves. And what they do is you usually get it approved through the buy now, pay later provider. And the buy now, pay later provider usually come into ourselves. So whether it's circumnavigating through the lender or directly, there has to be a clear audit trail to say what ended up in front of that customer was approved by a regulated firm. And now those regulated firms that are approving those financial promotions have got to have a separate set of permissions from the FCA. As I say, the gateway only opened this year for firms like ourselves to submit applications such as that.
And if I'm correct, Philip, for Product Partnerships Limited to achieve that level of permission is incredibly difficult. I don't think many firms, you might be one of, I can't count on one hand maybe, that have been selected by the FCA with this. Am I right?
I mean, I interact with various trade associations, and I don't know many firms that do it. And we're a rare breed, I suppose, in many ways. The answer is yes, it has been a challenging process to go through. We've invested large sums of money in technology to have a platform for these firms to put the financial promotions in, to have a full audit trail, that when the financial promotion lands, it's not just a case of someone looking at it. They have to go through an audit checklist and make sure everything has been checked within it. And it's either rejected, approved, or request for edits. There's no other variant to that. And the request for edits has got to come back with the approved version at the end. Then we've got to supply to the FCA on a regular basis how many financial promotions we've approved and to which firms. So we've got to declare what we're doing. So the full audit trail from end to end has been scrutinised. And as I say, we're in a gateway process ourselves at the moment, as are any other firms that have chose to apply for this type of work. But there's a sudden vacuum of firms now that need support from an authorised entity to be able to, an approved entity to approve these financial promotions. So it's quite a large piece of work, really. And I think a lot of firms try to do this in a template way. So rather than having thousands of financial promotions come through, that we can approve a template. But you've got to be careful with templates. How much are they going to be changed? If you're just changing the colour of the car, fine. But if you're changing the price from, quite dramatically, or the interest rate change, the context has completely changed and it needs reapproving. So it needs a very slick process that's well audited and by experienced people who understand the rules as well, I'd say.
Wow. Philip, in closing, we've been working together for about 2 years. I hope you'll agree we've built a solid partnership. So as a closing thought, can you just share with our audience, what led you to choosing call monitoring, to choosing voice, specifically to ensure the monitoring and compliance of your network?
So I've, as I said at the beginning, worked in regulated firms now for over 30 years, and quite commonly in large call centres. And in those call centres, I'm used to seeing banks of staff sat there with headsets on, listening to calls all day, every day. The rise of AI, of RegTech technology and platforms like yours, they just allow us to get a bigger perspective on what's going on out there. So as I said at the start, generally speaking, compliance people would be doing sampling. And based on the outputs of that sampling, they would do more or less, but it was just sampling. And it can be quite arduous. So one of my team, Nikki, she's been in the industry now for, goodness me, I'll probably give the game away, but a long time. And she's done nothing but call listening. It's a long time listening to customer conversations. But what Voic has enabled her to do now is she's just listening to the conversations that need triaging. So rather than a 20-minute conversation, it's now a 3-minute conversation, and we're listening to the bit that's important. That doesn't mean to say we don't listen to the rest of it for context. It's being able to triage those calls very quickly, identifying vulnerable customers, and picking up complaint scenarios much quicker.
Fantastic. And I did see in the FCA's notes on the changes in the AR regime, they said if your AR network expands, your staff also have to expand.
Yes.
They wanted to see a proportionality there, and this, I guess, gives you the ability to have some more, hands on deck. You have expanded your company massively since we joined, but it now makes everyone have a multiplier effect.
Yeah, I mean, you can't rely on technology alone. Yeah. And I think that's not just me talking. That's, it's proven that you still need to have human intervention from trained people who are skilled in understanding what they're looking for. But RegTech has definitely assisted firms, and it certainly assists us in having a wider and deeper understanding of what's going on. And it informs and points the team in the right direction. Ultimately, we all want the same thing, is protecting customers and delivering great outcomes for everybody.
Let's end it on that, protecting customers and delivering outcomes. Thank you, Philip. Thank you for your time.
No problem. Good to see you, Matthew.
Cheers. Thank you, Philip. Cheers.